Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to Adult Forum this morning. It's my great privilege to introduce Dr. Bruce Gourley, who I'm going to let give you the snippets of his CV as he wants to. It's online, so you can read all about him if you want. A little bit of the backstory of the invitation to Bruce. I heard him speak here back in the fall. Was it fall? It wasn't last spring. I think it was fall. A version of what he'll be presenting in three parts to us, to the Gallatin Valley Interfaith Association, and was fascinated by some of the history, some of the details I kind of had known but maybe had forgotten, but putting some of the pieces together in a way to think about what gets labeled White Christian Nationalism in the United States. It's a phrase that gets thrown about in different contexts, and I have a sense that not everybody always knows exactly what that means. And so thinking how, for me, the question is, how do we think about this theologically and this movement in our country and in other places, nationalist movements in other places around the world, but especially groups that would think of themselves as Christian nationalists, as Lutherans who would probably not think in the same way. But so how do we understand and think about some of the things that happen in our world? And so Bruce will be here. This is part one of three, not next week, but the following, and then not the next week, but the following. So we have a couple of intervening. So next week, our Adult Forum will be using some resources from Interfaith Power and Light for Faith Climate Action Week, which is actually happening right now. We'll be watching a movie that's a film that's a compilation of three shorter stories about movements towards a clean energy economy, paying special attention to workers in fossil fuel sector and communities that would be radically affected by a transition to a clean energy economy. So that'll be next week. And then on May 6th, we'll welcome J.P. Carlson, our LCM campus pastor, and students who went on the spring break trip to Guatemala for our Adult Forum. So that, and then Bruce will round it out. So that's the lay of the land for Adult Forum between now and Pentecost. And this will be recorded. Thank you, Libby, for getting it recorded on your phone. Hopefully we'll get the better camera for the next couple. But with that, I'll turn it over to Bruce. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to see everyone. Some folks I know, some folks I don't. I am a historian. My emphasis, my doctoral work was American history, intersecting with Civil War and religion, and also secondarily Islamic history, actually. So I've written widely. I've written a number of books. I'm primarily a writing historian and a public speaking historian. I do Ali courses at Montana State University, Ocean Lifelong Learning Institute, and really enjoy that. So it's good to be here with you this morning. This is a fairly short presentation, but I want 9:45 we're ending.
Yep.
Yes. So I want to make sure I leave enough time for any conversation. So Christian nationalism is a phrase that in recent years has become very popular. Perhaps you've noticed this. If there's a spectrum as we think of Christian nationalism as to what it can mean. Over here, at its most benign, if you will, there are folks who believe that America is a Christian nation. They may not know exactly why. It's kind of fuzzy. But the basic belief of Christian nationalism, the foundation of it, is that the belief that America is a Christian nation. But for some, it's somewhat benign. So over here, there's somewhat of a benign expression of people believing America is a Christian nation. They may think it was founded as a Christian nation. It was not. Or they may think it is a Christian nation in a very vague sense. Then over here are people who are certain that America was founded as a Christian nation. They're very adamant about that. Again, it's a false belief. They really believe it. They talk about it. They kind of evangelize even about it. And then over here is even further, kind of on the far right, and not only a belief in America being founded as a Christian nation, but a fierce belief in America being founded as and being a Christian nation and willing to fight for America being a Christian nation. Over here is where January 6th evolved. We saw on January 6th an expression of white Christian nationalism. It's kind of the militant to even military, sometimes, expression oftentimes violent Christian nationalism. The backstory to all of this in the history of Christianity is that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' wilderness temptation up on top of the massive mountain looking over the kingdoms of the world, he was tempted by evil to use power to force God upon the world, if you recall that final temptation. To take over the world as a military power, wealth, and political power, and force God upon the world. He said that was evil, and he wasn't going to do it. Then he went down to the hill, little hill, where he preached a sermon on the mount, and he projected an entirely different kind of ministry, or messiahship, if you will, in which if evil tempted Jesus to be a God of the fist, okay, on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus showed that he was a God of the heart, so the fist and the heart. We fast forward to Constantine in the 4th century, and Constantine seized a hold of the Christian church and made it part of his fist, made it part of his militant empire. And that continued to be, if we're honest, a dominant stream of Christianity for a very, very long time. And then we get down to the 1600s and the Puritans and the Pilgrims, and also Jamestown, colony founded in the early 1600s. The Pilgrims and the Puritans sailed to America with a fist, with a God of power, with the belief that they were God's chosen ones to establish a new Jerusalem or a new Israel in the New World, and to dominate over others. If you start reading documents from the 1630s, I'll focus on the Puritans for a moment. In 1630, Boston was founded, and Puritanism formally emerged. If you read documents from that era of the laws they enacted in colonial Massachusetts at that time, the Bay Colony there, by 1642, there was a compilation of New England laws that listed out in a very extensive document the laws that were predominant that encompassed New England, which were in Massachusetts and Connecticut especially, but few other colonies as well. In the civil laws of these colonies written in the 1642 document, which is available online, their laws literally came from the Old Testament. Literally. Out to the side, they had the references, and pretty much they almost copied verbatim many of the Old Testament laws. There were about 100 or more scriptural references, almost all from the Old Testament, in a God of the fist, of power, of dominance, authoritarianism. There were none from Jesus' teachings. Not a one. And that mentality of authoritarianism and power became a model throughout much of the colonial America in terms of colonies being founded as theocracies or ruled by God. Although God was never actually there, it was men pretending to speak on behalf of God, to rule on behalf of God. Always men, white men. There was another group that came to America as well, and there were seekers or dissenters from the Church of England, as the Puritans had been as well, but they came to America seeking religious freedom only for themselves. Their religious freedom dominating over others. Others came really troubled by the persecutions Christians were receiving by the state church in England, Old England, including Baptists, who my faith background is Baptist, including Baptists who came to America seeking not just freedom for themselves, but equal freedom of conscience and freedom of religion for everyone. In the 1630s and 1640s, this was radical. It was so heretical that the affisted Christian expression, which was known as the Establishment Church in the New World. The Establishment Church in the North was the Congregational Church. In the South was the Episcopal Church, or Anglican Church back then, I should say. And so Roger Williams, the founder of Rhode Island, was a Baptist, and some others came over here. And they came with a really radical message, so radical that they were rejected as heretics. Proper Christians did not even believe Baptists were Christians because they taught equal freedom of conscience and equal religious liberty for everyone, including Muslims and heretics and pagans and Jews, Catholics and others. It wasn't that Baptists did not have their own strong religious convictions, they did. But they believed that God alone was Lord of the conscience, not the state, not politicians, no one else. And that was illegal back then. Many were persecuted. Baptists, others as well, seekers. They were whipped, put in the stocks, public stocks in Boston. Whipped and flogged in public, many were. Many had their children taken away from them and given to proper Christian parents. They wouldn't pay taxes to the colonies, the government, if you will, because their taxes would have gone to support the establishment of official Christian churches. They didn't believe in that. And so they oftentimes had their lands confiscated. They were stoned, they were waterboarded, simulated waterboarding. Baptists baptized underwater. And so at times the Christian authorities would hold a Baptist pastor underwater, pretending he was like immersion, okay? But hold him as long as they could before he died, and pull him back up and ask him if he was ready to repent. Back down again. It really was brutal. I'm just giving you a snapshot of what that world was like. But the Baptists, the Quakers, and other dissenters resisted, and especially the Baptists, because their numbers did grow despite the fact they were persecuted. And over time, these two paths, the iron-fisted Christianity of the New World, okay, and the heart, or the more empathetic Christianity of Baptists and other dissenters and seekers, who had their own particular beliefs, are oftentimes adamant about that, but wanted everyone to have equal freedoms. Those two paths moved forward in the New World, leading to the formation of the United States of America. 11 of the 13 colonies had some form of establishment church, official state church, official proper beliefs that people were supposed to believe, citizens, or they could be persecuted, including death. So 11 of the 13. So in some ways, it's surprising that America was founded as a secular nation, not a religious, and in particular, Christian nation. The story of that is that Baptists and other dissenters, allied with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison especially, to resist founding America as a theocratic nation. Because by then, the Enlightenment had come along. And Enlightenment thinkers agreed with Baptists and other dissenters and seekers of the need for equal freedom of conscience and religious liberty for all. So if the Puritans were iron-fisted, the Baptists and other dissenters were of the heart, of the fist of the heart, respectively. The Enlightenment folk like Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and others were of the mind. It was reason. Fist, heart, mind, or reason. And so they and dissenters arrived at the same place of the need for equal freedom. I say everyone. Really, back then it wasn't really everyone. Okay, if we're honest. Nonetheless, America was founded as a secular nation, separating church from state. There was no test oath for office in the Constitution in Europe. You had to be a Christian to serve in office. In America, you did not. It was scandalous. In much of America, it was scandalous, much less Europe. Many Christians criticized that in the First Amendment, separating church and state. Many Christians of the late 1790s and into the early 1800s were very upset that America had been founded as a Christian nation. Today, there are many Christians, especially white evangelical Christians, who will say America was founded as a Christian nation, seemingly unaware that their ancestors experienced a completely different reality and complained about America being founded as a secular nation. We've forgotten our history. So America was founded as a secular nation. Some Christians were happy and some were not. Baptists were ecstatic, by the way, because they were no longer persecuted. And other dissenters were, and non-Christians of all kinds were as well. They praised Jefferson. Former establishment Christians who had been privileged by the state were very unhappy about losing their privileges. Their tax dollars paying for the churches, their tax dollars paying for the ministers, their tax dollars supporting their particular brand of Christianity, which was allowed to discriminate against and persecute others and even dominate over others. Fast forward to the moving towards the Civil War era, many of the Christians in the South, white Christians that had been unhappy with America being founded as a Christian nation, and not only that, but a lot of Baptists who conveniently began forgetting about their own past as they moved away from being lower down the socioeconomic ladder and started moving up that socioeconomic ladder in the South, owning slaves, changed their minds about things. And when the imagined nation they call the Confederate States of America was founded in 1861, they actually, in their Constitution, the Confederate Constitution, invoked God as their guide. They established themselves, the Confederacy did, as a Christian nation. They talked about it a lot, those Confederate leaders did. From the leadership on down to the ministers, to the politicians, average folks on the ground, if you will. It was understood in the white South, among most whites, I know there were dissenters, that the Confederate States of America was finally a proper Christian nation in what had been the United States in the South. They had done what the founders had refused to do. They had created a Christian nation. And God had charged them with spreading slavery throughout the world because it was God's institution in their mind, in their fist. And the mind can be used for the fist or the heart, by the way. Have you noticed this? The mind. Reason, both sides these days in our world today, Christian nationalists and those of us who oppose them, we use reason in our arguments, if you will, for what we believe. So the Confederacy lost that ideological and battlefield battle. But the belief in America, that thread that wanted to believe America was a Christian nation, that wanted to make America a Christian nation, and that wanting to make America as a Christian nation started as early as the 18-teens, really, to try to do that. The Confederacy was, for a brief period of time, a self-perceived Christian nation. And by the 20th century, there is a greater perception of, there's a growing desire among many Christians to make America a Christian nation. Among presidents, if we use the presidential office as kind of somewhat of a high-level measuring rod, if you will, the presidents up until the late 1800s, that is, all really affirmed church-state separation in the First Amendment and in the Constitution as well. Around the late 1800s, in the Gilded Age going forward, some presidents began backing away from that. And we began to see some mingling, more and more mingling of church and state. And if you haven't noticed, there's quite a bit of that today. But even the Supreme Court seems to have forgotten the Constitution and the First Amendment in many ways. All of this channeled, if you will, in the 20th century, last century, into the mid-50s, in what became known as civil religion. Some of you may remember or have heard this story that only in the past, what is now about 70 years, have we been reciting the particular Pledge of Allegiance that we are now reciting. Some of you heard this story. It used the original pledge, which is written by a Baptist minister, did not have the words "under God" in it. That was added in the 50s. "In God we trust" was added to currency in the 50s. It was a time following World War II and the rise of communism that many it was mainly white Christians, but although the religious fervor was such in the 50s that across the board, Congress came together and with President Eisenhower and basically codified or passed legislation creating our motto, "In God We Trust," coined currency and adding under God to the Pledge of Allegiance in response to godless communism, primarily. But there was another development that Christian nationalists, and here again we're speaking of folks who believe America's a Christian nation, there's a spectrum of this, but in the 50s there comes to be an increasingly kind of middle to fierce expression of Christian nationalism, as America must be a Christian nation in order to counter the godless influence of communism and integration, or civil rights, or equal rights. And the 60s was a period of time throughout America in which, as we move closer and closer as a nation towards granting equal rights to more people, the more anxiety resulted among many white Christians across America, and not just in the South, where I grew up in the South, but other places as well. In the name of God, resisting human equality, just like in the name of God during the Confederacy, many white Christians of the South insisted that slavery had been God's will for black people. And by the way, if you hear someone tell you of the Civil War, it was not about slavery, you may have heard that. That's not what they said during the Civil War. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, one of his most famous speeches was called the Cornerstone Speech, and he said, and they used the term African slavery back then, African slavery is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. You can't get much clearer than that. In the civil rights era of the 1960s, whether we lived through it or not, whether we remember it or not, for those of us who don't remember that, we can see the footage of that era, of the violence that took place by white folks against black folks, especially in the South, but there was violence in the North as well, in the name of God. Folks, Christians of the fist, insisting that their religious liberty granted them the right to discriminate against others, which is what they'd said during the Civil War. We're still talking that language today. And some people are, if you haven't noticed. This is all a part of Christian nationalism. So, beginning in the 50s, and Billy Graham actually played a big part in beginning to really think of America as formally a Christian nation, not just fuzzily a Christian nation, but structurally a Christian nation. Christianity being formally embedded within national documents, if you will. And there began to be a systemic pushback in America in the 60s, and especially in the 70s, of arguing that America had not been founded as a secular nation. Basically mythologizing history, changing history systematically to something which it was not. A pushback on the First Amendment. Trying to reinterpret in a way that said that basically Christianity was allowed to do whatever it wanted to do in America, and Christianity was the predominant faith in America. And so now it's not just a cottage industry, there is a massive industry in white American evangelicalism, which is selling millions of books out there, telling the story that America was not founded as a secular nation, but a Christian nation. In the 1970s is when what we now think of as the Christian right or the religious right began rising. forming organizations, creating an industry to try to transform the federal government to reflect what they believed America really was, which is a Christian nation. The backstory to all of this, including the backstory how white evangelicals came to embrace the anti-abortion movement, because most were not anti-abortion before 1973, and most did not become anti-abortion until after 1973. But the backstory to that is an anxiety among many white evangelicals, I grew up that way, among many white evangelicals of this idea of other people of other color being their legal equals, if you will, having the same rights they did. And that anxiety led to a pushback against a federal government increasingly inclusive of more and more people, increasingly embracing human equality and equal rights and civil rights. And within that rubric of opposition to democracy, that is to inclusive democracy, the religious right rises, and opposition to abortion becomes, there's a story behind this, not enough time to tell it, but opposition to abortion becomes kind of, within the white evangelical community, a feel-good way of opposing an increasingly liberal federal government, is what it amounts to. Opposition to democracy. When the Puritans came to America, we have a lot of quotes because they wrote a lot. We have a lot of records from the Puritan era. And the leaders talked about how that they did not come here to America to create a democracy. They came to create biblical commonwealth and to force people, Native Americans and others, to believe the way they did, or they would be willing to kill them to do so. Even the Charter of Jamestown, which was not Puritan, it was chartered by the Church of England, gave the right to the colonists, it was a capitalistic enterprise, to kill native peoples who did not submit to their Christian overtures. So democracy was never a goal in colonial America, at least an inclusive democracy. It's easy to have a democracy if everyone thinks the same way you do, right? But what if we don't? Democracy gets complicated. For the Puritans, for a while, it was fairly easy because it was authoritarian, fisted, and most everyone was forced to believe and behave a certain way. But now in our day and time, in modern America, that is not the case. There is a legacy that goes all the way back to Puritanism that leads us where we are today in seeing opposition to inclusive democracy. I've sketched some really broad brushstrokes. I'd like to spend the last 10 minutes or so, 10, 12, 13, whatever minutes we have, just having a little bit of dialogue. It's impossible to tell too much of a story in just a few minutes, of course. But I hope this gives you, some sketch of an idea of a thread or a current that has led us to where we are today in this belief that America was a Christian nation. Many Christian nationalists would argue, do try to argue that the founders were all evangelical Christians. No. And they will be shocked if they were told that today if they were alive. What they're not really reaching back to our founding, as that many say they do. The reality is they're reaching back to the colonial theocratic era. They want to make America some form of a theocracy. January the 6th was an effort to do that. Opposition to inclusive democracy, a desire to have God's chosen one reign not just as an elected president, but as an illegitimate, democracy-wise, president, and have him be in office as long as he wanted to be. And white Christian nationalists were Donald Trump's biggest supporters. So let me stop there. I'll talk more about, in recent, 2 weeks from now, developments from the 70s to the present, but I wanted to tie things in the past to the present before doing that. Some of you have probably had experiences with Christian nationalists, perhaps in your families, Perhaps you were raised that way as I was, for the record, over here on kind of the fuzzy area, before I started reading history and realized I've been told a lot of myths growing up. Questions or comments you might have, let's just have a few moments to if you would like, to have a bit of a conversation. For some of you, this is not altogether new.
If I were a white Christian nationalist, and I suppose there again there's all kinds, well, you've already said there's many kinds, but when they say Christian, what do they mean?
So, and that is at the center of all of this, and the analogy I'm using today is, the reality is Christianity can be defined in many different ways, and it is defined in many different ways. But authoritarianism is what I'm trying to communicate, is how they think of Christianity. They may not use the word authoritarianism, but they believe in a very structured, hierarchical type of Christianity, which tells them what they must believe, what they should avoid. Sociologists sometimes call this an enclave. I grew up in a religious enclave. All truth was inside the enclave. Outside the enclave was dangerous, because what was outside was not true, and so you were not to be contaminated by the outside. Authoritarianism typically is paternalistic. It's very male structured. The Puritans had very much centered their existence on the family. And if today, white Christian nationalists are oftentimes very family-centric, with a very structured hierarchy, male, female, and children, and a very structured hierarchy in how, in the sense of there's a vertical axis in which, with God at the top and white males next and so forth, in which you exist in a certain part of that axis, and you're told what to believe and how to behave and how to stay in line. It is a faith that sees a black and white world. There's no way of saying this. There's not much gray in between.
White world.
Okay.
Not black.
Okay. But there's not much gray, right? There's not much fuzzy area, because fuzzy is bad. If you're on the far side over here of a Christian nationalist, and they pretend the Bible is very clear in what it says. Have you noticed? It's always much more complicated than that. They don't like complications. As opposed to a Jesus-centric Christianity is what I sometimes say, a gospel Jesus-centric Christianity. From the Sermon on the Mount, for example, which is a very empathy-oriented type ministry Jesus had, what he calls his followers to follow. That is something that you oftentimes don't see much empathy among white Christian nationalists. Scientists tell us that we as humans, literally, we tend to, in effect, be born with certain mind orientations of our minds that in some cases propel one to be of an authoritarian mindset in our minds. In other cases, one tends to be more empathetic. And from neurological studies, neurologists, this is not just a male-female thing, actually. It can be in either gender or others as well. So, there's all kinds of components to this, but that's kind of a sketch. Someone else, yes.
Well, I just want to thank you for, even though it's very brief, because I had listened to a podcast, and it was a journalist that had followed some of the things going on with the insurrection on January 6th. And part of it was just the listening as when the Capitol had been breached, some of them praying.
Yes.
And I was just shocked, when I heard that, because it was like, whoa, this has just happened, but they're praying and thanking God for all this happening, and it makes more sense. So, thank you.
Praying for God's blessings as they overthrew America.
Yes.
So then what you say, based on what Jerry asked and what you said, is that, and this is my belief, is that the Christianity is sort of an excuse, it's a veil, it's more about authoritarian, and it's more about you're in our club, and the people who want to stay in have to obey. It's about obedience, and it's about really about the authoritarian, because there's really nothing Christian about it. That's just a legitimizing veil or label that makes it sound like it's really of this, when it really at its core is all of that.
Okay.
Like Jerry said, it was not Christian at all, other than obedience and a feigned belief that God is in charge, who they never listened to, honestly.
So
So does that sound about?
I think there's several ways of looking at this. And as a historian, here's how I look at this. The on-the-ground reality of the story of Christianity for a very long time was predominantly an authoritarian God. So it was Christianity. It was empire Christianity. And it was institutional empire Christianity. By that I mean it was church and state from the 4th century forward, allied together, oftentimes using militant, violent ends to determine who is in and who is out, who can be killed, if we're honest, and who can be accepted. So yes, depending on how we look, it's complicated. So some will say, well, this is not Christianity. I would respond to that by saying, well, it's been pragmatically, it has been a major theory of Christianity, but it is opposed to the teachings of Jesus. Now, there's something else interesting in this too. The Jesus of the Gospels, perhaps you've noticed this, is a different portrait of Jesus than the Jesus of the book of Revelation. Have you noticed this? In the book of Revelation, Jesus is a warrior who slaughters people. And allegedly, in modern times, and many people say, a final battle between good and evil will come in the future. It's two different portraits of Jesus that, if we're honest, don't really match up very well. And a lot of Christian nationalists use that Revelation portrait of Jesus and not the Gospels portrait of Jesus. The reality is the book of Revelation was not written for our day and time. It was written at that present day and time with a message about God. But the Bible itself, again, if we're honest, has different portraits of God.
And honestly, there are thousands of Christianities. We all know the way that people approach the Bible and God does vary quite a bit. And you're right, this is a legitimate way of seeing the faith that we don't agree with as Lutherans, but it's actually pretty common, just like Orthodox, just like all these other ones that are very different, but they're looking in a different way. And it is obviously legitimate. But yeah, you're more correct on this, that is the history of it. That's ever since Constantine, it's been in that shithole as far as I'm concerned since Constantine. And most people here, I think, are understand.
It's uncomfortable, but if we're true with ourselves,
it is true.
Yes.
So opening the lens a little bit,
Okay.
it seems like there's been some trends toward authoritarian government preferences globally in the last period of time, and maybe there are like global or national trends that come and go. Is there any kind of explanatory framework for what's kind of drawing folks toward those preferences?
Why now?
Yeah.
Why now? In the 21st century, really. So I don't know of any hard and fast data on this. A lot of people are studying it, are certainly studying it. My sense is that we live in a really complicated world in which, as nations grow larger in size and complexity, answers are more elusive and ever grayer, oftentimes. For those who tend to be of an authoritarian mindset, that's a very uncomfortable world. It just is. Some of us who are not of an authoritarian mindset, we struggle to understand. We struggle to parse out what's going on, if you will. But I think around the world that's part of the issue. I think part of the issue too is that throughout human history, there has been a major thread of humanity, of humans having an authoritarian bent. From early human days, from tribalism of the past to partisanship of the present, or as George Washington said in his farewell address, to factions. He feared, Washington did, factions could one day tear apart America and lead to the rise of a strong man, in our words today, of a figure who deceived America and literally led the nation to, quote, riots and insurrection against democracy. Read his farewell address sometime.
Wow.
We saw authoritarianism throughout the 20th century, including in Germany, of course. So I don't think anything is necessarily new. I think maybe it's surprising in the sense that many of us think we should have progressed beyond that. Really, is one way I think of looking at that. Your thoughts? You have thoughts on that?
I want, sequelae of the global financial crisis, like disruptions with climate change. Like, I wonder if there's any kind of mapping of cause and effect with some of these kind of trends, and historical trends.
I do know that presently a lot of Christian nationalists believe that's just another sign that the world's coming to an end. We don't need to worry about that stuff, but it is a sign that the world's coming to an end, and they tie all this stuff together, and it feeds to the authoritarian current that's going on for sure. Yes, sir.
I was just going to say that in reference to his question is that I think people today want to be led.
Want to be?
They want to be led.
Led, yes, okay.
Okay? They're looking for someone to tell them, this is the way.
Sure.
And unfortunately, the way that we're evolving throughout the world, through authoritarian leaders, if you will, they're following that way. I'll never forget my sister-in-law. We're in Florida, and she lost her way as to directions as to which way to go. And I was trying to tell her, and she goes, no, just stop. Just tell me what to do, and I'll follow. And I think that's where we are in the world. Why we are, I don't know.
I think you're exactly right, and I think that's been the case throughout much of history for many people. They would rather be told what to believe and what to do.
Maybe another kind of version of that is that there seems to be some desire to have the correct answer.
That's
as
right.
opposed to pursuing important questions. We can pursue questions where the answers can kind of be a little fuzzy versus let's have the right answer.
That's the two different Christianities too, of the
Yeah,
same way, aren't they?
we can all do
In
it
that-
at different
in that
times,
part.
yeah.
Yeah.
But sometimes the question may be more important than the answer.
In questions, there were a lot of questions that were not allowed when I was growing up in a Christian nationalist environment. You're not allowed to ask certain questions. And because I started asking the wrong questions is when I started getting in trouble and started reading the wrong books. But yes, I think it's a part of it. It's a comfort. There's a comfort in not having to ask questions. There's a comfort in that in many ways. And yes, in some ways it does make life easier.
In an uncertain world, certainty is a great balm and assurance.
It is.
I mean, they even sing blessed assurance as we live in a certain way, but this is how it works.
So
It's very comforting, right?
it is. Thank you all. Our time is up.
Thank you so much. Just a reminder for those of you who arrived maybe a little bit after we started, Bruce will be back 2 more times. Not next week. Next week we're going to watch a film about transitions to a clean energy economy, paying special attention to folks who will be most impacted by that, fossil fuel workers and frontline communities. And then Bruce will be back for part 2. The following week we'll have JP Carlson and students from a campus ministry who went to Guatemala on their spring break. And then the week after, Bruce will come again to wrap up. I know the Tuesday Men's Group read a book by an ELCA author about the psychology of Christian nationalism. There's a copy of that on the cart, in the CtK library cart, as well as a few other books that were purchased very recently. They're new on the cart to help provide a bigger perspective on how we might think about these things theologically too. So there you go. Go to worship.
Oh, else is.